In today's flipped lecture, we're going to be discussing the underlying issues that help cause the Civil War. And the Civil War is a really important event in understanding American history. More Americans are going to die in this war than in any other conflict in American history. It's going to be the last war fought inside the United States, and so the southern part of the country is going to be largely destroyed. It's going to be a total war, and that's going to affect the lives of all Americans who lived during this time, both soldiers and not. And finally, it's going to live on in American memory through memorials and cemeteries, and it's actually still a controversial issue to this day. And the Civil War is really a crossroads of the United States, where it changes from what the United States used to be, kind of a more loose configuration of states, to the United States being one country. And the idea of one nation indivisible comes after the American Civil War, not before. And it's the crossroads of our being as a country because the United States really becomes one country as a result of this war. It's also going to end slavery and the Southern plantation way of life. And in ending that way of life, it began the dominance of industry in cities in U.S. history that we talked about in our last unit. It also led to a huge increase in the size, power, and authority of the federal government and a decline in the power of individual states. And it also is going to change the meaning of equality, freedom, and American values. So in trying to understand why a civil war happens, why would Americans fight Americans, why would families turn against each other, we have to look at some of the big issues that faced the United States during the lead up to the American Civil War. And really, this is a debate that's not settled. Historians disagree on why the Civil War was fought, what caused it, or ultimately what the significance of the war actually was. And so I'm going to try to give you kind of a general overview of some of the popular arguments. And the first thing to look at are the unresolved political issues of the early United States of America. The United States was founded in 1776 with the Declaration of Independence, but there were a lot of unresolved problems that existed from the start of the nation's history. The first was the institution of slavery, where the United States consistently failed to address the issue of slavery, each generation kind of kicking the can down the road. The second unresolved issue was federalism, and how power would be shared between states and the federal government. There were those who believed that the states should have more power, and those who believed the federal government should be more powerful. And in American history, from 1776 to 1860, that issue largely goes unfinished, unresolved. And then also there's even the definition of what the United States of America was. There were some who believed that it was just an alliance of different states, and there was others who believed the United States was one country. There were also very significant regional and cultural differences between these two regions of the country, the northern and the southern United States. The northern United States had a much larger population, as well as a much larger amount of immigrants, both already there and coming into the country. The northern economy was based on developing industry, fishing on the coast, and small family farms. The North had more urban areas, and so the culture of the North began to be centered in cities. And Northerners really don't need slavery because of their economy being more industrial and having smaller farms. The North doesn't need slavery, and so slavery dies out in the North largely before the Civil War. And the effort to end slavery, which gains a lot of momentum in the North, is going to be called abolition, and that's going to cause problems with the South. And then finally, the northern United States looked at the federal government as the main ruling power inside of the United States. Now, contrasting the northern United States is the southern U.S. The southern U.S. had a much smaller population, and in fact, 1/3 of those living in the South were actually slaves. The South was based on an agricultural economy, with both large plantations, making cash crops such as cotton, and small family farms or small farms owned by individuals in the South. And now, because of the agricultural economy, the South was pretty rural. There weren't a lot of large cities, people were pretty spread out, and most most Southerners either lived on farms or in small towns or villages. Another big difference was that slavery was necessary to the Southern plantation economy. Without slavery, they simply would not have been able to make their economy work. But it was also key to the culture of the South. In the Southern planter aristocracy, slavery was important culturally. And finally, those in the southern United States tended to believe that the state and local government should have a lot more power than the federal government. People in the South tended to be distrustful of a national government. And like we said, the North began developing industry, and this changed their economic interests. Factories began to develop, and with it came a decline in agriculture's importance in the North. But in the South, very, very different story. In the South, you had a lot of plantations, small farms, and this was an economy that was not industrializing, and so was entirely based upon agriculture. And as part of this southern plantation economy, you have the institution of slavery as a very important piece. And so conflicts over slavery are going to be also wrapped up in conflicts over economy. So slavery as an institution had existed in the United States from colonization way before the U.S. was even a country. However, slavery in the North largely died out as the economy shifted so that slaves were actually more trouble than they were worth, they were more expensive, and so the North basically abolished slavery over a period of time. But by 1860, in the start of the Civil War, there were 4 million slaves in the United States. The South had a population of only 6 million at the time. So it kind of gives you some perspective about how many slaves there were versus actual people in the United States. But in 1808, the international slave trade had been banned. But the slave trade continued inside of the United States. And the conditions that slaves endured varied. But slavery, very brutal institution. We talked about dehumanization before, and there was violence associated with this slavery. Whenever you hold somebody against their will, there's going to be violence involved. And this led to many in the North to try to come up with a movement called the abolitionist movement to end slavery in the South. And that would create a lot of conflicts between the two regions. And so slavery in the South was a way of life. Selling of slaves at auctions was an ordinary thing. Here is a picture of a newspaper article saying that this guy has slaves to sell, and he is talking about their ages and what they're able to do as though they were pieces of property and not human beings. You also have a lot of depictions of slavery. Here you see a slave master taking a baby away from a parent. So this is a very violent institution. It separates families, and Northerners began to start to say that slavery was immoral and start to take steps to try to end it. Some more pictures of slavery in the American South. However, I want to back it up a second because not everyone in the South owned slaves. In fact, a full 3/4 of all Southerners did not own any slaves at all. And 88% of those who did own slaves owned less than 20. Most of the Southerners were actually what are known as yeoman farmers, who had small farms that they worked themselves. And so a lot of these farmers who didn't have slaves or never would own slaves made up most of the South, but they still supported slavery. There's kind of the idea that some of these farmers aspired to one day rise in class and wealth and have their own slaves, but also, too, with the slaves as a lower class, the yeomen are not the lowest class in the American South. But just to kind of put into perspective how many people actually own slaves in the South, it's important to understand that because the war was about more than just the institution of slavery. And so the country begins to move towards war because of struggles over certain issues. One of the main issues was the power struggle between states and the national government, and with that the debate over the meaning of union. Then there was the issue of slavery, which was the spark that kept bringing up these other tensions that were going on between the North and the South. There were also regional conflicts over politics, culture, and economy, and fundamentally different dreams about what the United States should be, what kind of a country that it should become. And these regional conflicts are based in the idea that two different identities develop with two different visions of the United States of America. Talked about that earlier with kind of the different economies, but it goes a lot deeper than that. And the debate over the kind of economy the country should have comes to a head in arguments about trade in the United States. The South advocated for more trade with European countries because they were an agricultural society, an agricultural economy who relied upon trade with Europe for their crops such as cotton. However, the North, that was mostly industrial and did not sell a lot of products in Europe, wanted less trade and high tariffs. Because to the North, if there was less trade, then there would be less competition from European industry. And also, the Northern society didn't need slaves. Slavery ends in the North because their economy does not require slavery. However, the Southern plantation economy needs slaves. And so these arguments about trade and economy also get wrapped up in arguments about tariffs and arguments about slavery. But again, it's rooted in the South wants the United States to have an agricultural economy, and the North wants the United States to have an industrialized economy. Then there's political debates, where the North wants a strong federal government, and for the United States to really act as one nation. The Southerners believed that the states should have more power than the federal government. And this also led to debates over whether slavery should expand into Western territory. And so there's a lot of debates over whether or not new territories should be slave or free. And then ultimately there's a different view of what the Union is, what the Union means. And so here's the debate over union. There were some states in the American South that believed that since they chose to join the Union during the Revolutionary War, when these different colonies all joined together, that they would be free to choose to leave the Union at any time. The Southern states believed the United States was an alliance and a partnership, but that the states themselves were sovereign, and that the states ruled themselves. However, many Northern states and the federal government disagreed, and believed that all the states must always remain a part of the USA, that the USA is one nation, and that the states are subordinate to the federal government. This is a pretty big difference of opinion, and so this big difference of opinion leads to some very bitter conflicts between North and South. Culturally, too. In the South, 80% of people were farmers. In the North, only 40% were farmers. In the South, less than 10% of people lived in cities. In the North, over 25% of people lived in cities. And so what you also had was the development of an urban culture and a rural culture that had different values and different visions of what the United States should look like culturally. And so with these differences, from the founding of the country to 1860, the political leaders of the country failed to resolve these issues that really divided the country. They failed to define what the Union, what the United States was. The economy, the vastly different economies actually required opposite economic policies. So if the government helped out the North, it would hurt the South. Or if the government helped out the South, it would hurt the North. And then finally, the country never deals with the issue of slavery until the American Civil War. And what we're going to look at next is that compromises are going to be made, disasters averted, but none of these solutions, none of these kind of compromises between North and South are going to fix a long-term solution. And so these conflicts are only going to get more intense. So just to quickly review the underlying issues that caused the American Civil War. In politics, the disagreement between who should have more power, the federal government or the state government. Also, there was the debate over the definition of the United States of America. Then, a debate over the balance of power between North and South, with Western expansion and the conflict between slave states and free. Then, in a social cultural sense, the institution of slavery is going to be a major cause of this civil war. And also the development of two separate urban and rural societies in the U.S. is going to mean that these two cultures are going to view the future of the United States differently. Then finally, in terms of the economy, the North is going to develop a more industrial economy, and the South is going to remain a plantation agriculture society, which is going to mean that any policy that helps one is probably going to hurt the other, as they have opposite interests. This is going to lead to disagreements over trade that are going to cause major crises, and then finally the institution of slavery. For the South, it was an economic necessity. For the North, it wasn't. And so this disagreement, this inability to see eye to eye on slavery, is also going to be an economic cause of this Civil War. So what we're going to look at next is we're going to look at how these big picture causes played out over the course of American history up to the American Civil War.